I could spend all of my days, going back, that's it, looking at your face and never get over it. Who's that talking about? Jesus. If we could go on to the second verse, I could spend the rest of my life looking into your eyes and never get out of it. Again, it's talking about Jesus. And then we go into the next, you are beautiful. How do we know? How do we know? We know because, number one, if we invite him into our lives, we experience him. But it's not just about that. It is because we've got the Gospels. The Gospels tell about the beautiful life of Jesus. Why have we got the Gospels? Because someone wrote down the life and the teachings and the events of Jesus. And that's what I want to be talking about this morning. What I want to do this morning is look at the Gospels and decide, are they a reliable account of Jesus? Can we trust them? Because when we come down to it, if I could have the laptop on now. When we come down to it, if it comes down to knowing if there's a God, and if there is a God, what is God like? Is he beautiful? What does that really come down to? Does it really come down to just the Bible tells us so? So if it comes down to knowing there's a God and what God's like, and if it really comes down to the Bible tells us so, are we expected to believe what we believe based on ancient manuscripts written by dozens of men, not women, dozens of men, over hundreds of years? I don't know if we can do something about the ringing, that would be helpful. In a world without modern science and where everybody believed in the gods. Weren't they just making stuff up? Weren't they just guessing? Should we be surprised that modern people are dismissing faith? Or even that might be where you are at this morning. Have we had doubts? I don't know. Have we, if you like, put less importance on our faith and maybe allowed other things to take things up? So if the Christian faith balances precariously on the edge of ancient declarations of superstitious men, why not walk away? Well, the reason is because the Christian faith is investigable. Apparently, investigatable is not a word. Investigable is the word, okay? So the truth is we're not expected to believe based on a collection of ancient manuscripts by men over a course of hundreds of years at a time when everyone was superstitious and everyone believed in gods and there was no modern science. The foundation of our faith is far more substantial than that, and it is investigable. I know this from personal experience because God sort of challenged me over 10 years ago to do a theology course. And when I did the theology course, it absolutely revolutionized my faith. It absolutely showed me that the Bible, this set of manuscripts, is unbelievably deep, and it could only have been written through the power of God's Spirit inspiring men to write it down, because that was the culture at the time. It's incredible. It's deepened my faith because I've investigated it. And it has led me on to, if you like, sort of not turn away from some of the really challenging questions in this life. Why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so much war and destruction? If God is a God who is good, why does he allow these things to happen? And what really annoys me is when we get people, if you like, online or whatever, saying, sort of basically saying, oh yeah, this is just written by these ancient men who were superstitious and there was no modern science and therefore it's not believable. And they haven't bothered to investigate it properly. They've just made some assumptions based on their ideas, and it's not fair on our faith. And so if we are going to give an answer as, we are commanded to do, we need to have an answer for our faith, then basically we need to investigate this. Yeah? We are invited to kick the tires. I don't know how many of you have bought a car before, but one of the things you do is kick the tires, It's hopefully we're going to do a bit more than that. I remember when we went to buy the minibus, we took Ian along from Wolfords, and Ian was there. He investigated that minibus. Okay, he had his sort of big torch, and he was underneath that minibus looking at all the rust and everything else. He was really going to town on that, and that's what God calls us to do. The Christian faith didn't rise and fall based on the accuracy or the errancy of 66 ancient documents that we now call the books of the Bible. It rises and falls on the identity of a single individual, and that single individual is Jesus of Nazareth. And that's why we're going to investigate the Gospels over the next few weeks. The question to ask when it comes to whether Christianity is something even worth taking seriously is this. It's not, is there a God, or is the Bible true? It really comes down to whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John a reliable account of actual events. If any one of those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, those accounts of Jesus' life and teachings is true, then game on. Because that's going to, if we are convinced that they are reliable accounts and those events really took place, then we need to do something about it. We will be challenged by what those Gospels say, because they describe someone who is beautiful and who has come to change the world and to change our lives. So, we need a timeline, okay? So, this is basically the story of the Christian faith in a nutshell. There was an event, the resurrection of Jesus. And immediately following the resurrection of Jesus, there was a new movement. Okay, it was called a Nazarene sect, or the Way. And eventually it was called the Church. And immediately following these events happening, people who were involved in this story actually documented those events for us. Okay, and we're going to look at that in a bit. And all of this happened within the first century. So we had the first 33 years of the first century, Jesus living. Then the next 35 years, this is probably, so within 70 years, all of these writings, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and most of the letters of Paul, etc., this is when this took place, within the first 70 years, because we can probably argue that it's happened before 70 AD, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome. And it wasn't until 300 years later that our first Bible, all of these 66 ancient documents, were collated together and we got the first Bible. And we'll look at why that was as well as we go through. So, the reason this is important is this. Okay, the story of Jesus, as I sort of alluded to in the all-age slot, all-age slot, the story of Jesus is not a Bible story. The story of Jesus, or the narrative, or the life of Jesus, is why there is a Bible. It's very easy to sort of read David and Goliath, or the parting of the Red Sea. All these are great Bible stories, and we think about the story of Jesus, but actually, we need to recognize that the Bible only exists because of an event which caused a movement, which caused it to be documented, which then led 300 years later to our first Bible, which we have in front of us 2,000 years later today. So if there was no resurrection, there would have been no church. If there was no church, there were no documents or nobody to document the story of the resurrection. And apart from the resurrection of Jesus, there is no Bible. So it all comes down to this event, the resurrection of Jesus. And if even only one of the Gospels or accounts of Jesus' life is true, then we need to investigate what that means for you and what it means for me. Yeah? So, the aim today is to set out why. The reason, so if you like, the first in the series is, okay, why can we be sure one of these Gospels is a reliable and true account of the life and teachings of Jesus? And then we will investigate that. Hopefully, unless everyone says, no, that's a load of rubbish, John. We'll investigate that over the next few weeks. So I'm going to be using just the first 4 verses of Luke. We're going to investigate the Gospel of Luke. So if you do want to follow in your Bible, just to make sure I'm not putting anything up that's not correct, we're going to start off in Luke 1:1. And if you are a writer, I am not a writer, but the first sentence is probably the most important sentence. You might rewrite and rewrite and rewrite that first sentence lots and lots of times because you want it to be right. You want to grab the attention of your audience. You want people to carry on reading. And Luke probably did this, and even the first word was important. Without looking at your Bibles, does anyone know what the first word is? No one. First word, it's a very common word. Often we just skip over this. Many. Many. Luke 1:1. Many. How many is many? Is 4 many? Is 40 many? I suppose it depends on the context, doesn't it? But Luke says many. And this is really important, okay? Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Many. I'm going to ask you a question. Please don't take offense. Do you know how many will undertake to draw up an account of your life? So, when you die, how many people do you think are going to, if you like, do your biography? Not many. Not many. Correct answer. I mean, even the famous, you might get 1 or 2 biographies. You know, if you were to go to the biography section of a bookshop, you might get 1 or 2 people who have decided to write up a biography of famous people like Winston Churchill or whatever. But for us, not many. So why were so many accounts? And we're not just talking about the 4 accounts that we now have in the Bible. Luke is saying many accounts. And we're going to look at later on that actually, you know, only certain manuscripts were chosen to be part of the Bible by the bishops in the 4th century. So Luke is saying that you need to know that I'm not the only one doing this. Many people have endeavored to do it. You know, not many people endeavor to write up the account of famous people. And that's especially true in the 1st century because it was very expensive and required a lot of time, and we didn't have computers and the resources and everything else available to do it. It was not as easy back then. Even Tiberius Caesar, who was Caesar in Jesus' time, there was not a storyline. No one wrote a biography. They had to piece it together. Pilate. Nothing. Apart from the odd quote, etc. You know, virtually nothing. Even Herod the Great, who was, and did extraordinary things. Only one person, that was Josephus, wrote about it. And that's it. So, the reason why so many people detailed the accounts of the lives of Jesus. You know, how many detailed accounts do we have of the lives of ancient peasants, crucified criminals, or even 1st century rabbis? None. But we have many accounts of Jesus of Nazareth because something extraordinary happened. Something that had implications for future generations, and something good had happened. Not just for Jerusalem and Galilee, but for the whole world. And someone had to tell it. Something extraordinary had happened. Something good had happened. So, Luke 1:1, many people have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So first of all, we've got many accounts. Therefore, something extraordinary, something good has happened, that many accounts, many people have tried to draw up these accounts of Jesus' life and his teachings. Very rarely do we also have these accounts being written up by someone who has lived through it. Often, these accounts are cobbled together after the time, okay? Mainly because people wouldn't, if we're talking about rich and famous and those who are doing these extraordinary things, they wouldn't be allowing you to write things that are going to put them in a bad light. So, it says it's been fulfilled among us. So Luke actually knew the men and women who played key roles in the story of Jesus. And he goes on, many have undertaken to draw up the account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And if we read the book of Acts, we know that Luke knew John, he knew Peter, he knew James, the brother of Jesus. So it's not as if this is sort of hundreds of years later and we're cobbling together stuff. This is accounts handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses. You don't get anything more reliable than someone who is an eyewitness of an event, of the things that happened. So, basically, Luke was saying, I've interviewed everyone I can because I wanted to make sure there's at least one account that covers all the bases. Moving on to verse 3. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated, having carefully followed along or having closely paid attention to the events, I myself have done all the research I can, talk to everyone I can. Therefore, with this in mind, since I myself have investigated everything from the beginning. Now, this is why Luke brings us the story of the birth of Jesus in the beginning. This is why he brings the story of John the Baptist from the beginning. He says, I've gone back as far as I can, and I want to give you the whole story. And this is not a once upon a time. This is not a Bible story. This is Luke telling us what happened in his lifetime, and it had to be told because it was extraordinary and it was good. And it was for the world, and it was for every generation. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about Jesus. Why? Because something extraordinary happened. Everything from the beginning. I too decided to write an orderly account for you. Now remember, Luke is not writing the Bible. He didn't ever have any idea there was going to be a Bible. He didn't know whether it would survive or who would read it. The document of Luke was included in the documents that was eventually titled the Bible because of what the story contained, when it was written, who wrote it, and what it said about Jesus. So, we shouldn't take Luke seriously because it's in the Bible. Okay? The other way around. I suppose Luke's account of the life of Jesus was written 300 years before the Bible was even assembled. Luke's account didn't become reliable when it was placed in the collection of documents that was called the Bible. It's important we get this the right way around. Luke's account of the life of Jesus was included in the Bible because Luke's account was considered reliable when it was written. Okay? If you've ever been to a hotel, often you will find there's a little safe which might look something like this. Yeah? If you're going to go out for a meal, you might decide to put some of the valuable things that you've got, I don't know, your iPad, for instance, or your passports, or money, or I don't know, jewelry, etc. You might put them in that safe. So here's the question. Do you put things in the safe to make them valuable? That's right. Or do you put things in the safe because they are valuable? Do you see where I'm going here? Has anyone caught on? So, Luke's account hasn't been made valuable because it's been put in the Bible. Luke's account is in the Bible because it is valuable. It is a first eyewitness account. It has been, if you like, meticulously researched. It has, from the beginning, Luke has talked to the eyewitnesses. He has gone through the entire of Jesus' life, talking to the eyewitnesses, do the research. He was a doctor. He knew his stuff. And he wrote down this account of Jesus' life and teachings. And because it is reliable, it was decided to put it in the Bible 300 years later. Oops. Okay. So Luke was placed in the collection of the books we call the Bible, not to make it valuable, not to make it true, but because it had been considered valuable from the moment it was written, because when it was written and who wrote it. So, if you're struggling with faith and all those big questions, like how could God allow all the evil in the world? We should all be bothered by those questions, by the way. Or we feel we have to look the other way and just pretend that God is just going to work it all out. I'm not going to look over there. Or if you're just considering Christianity, it really comes down to this. This is the question. Is Luke lying? After all I've just said, do you think Luke is lying? Okay. I think we often underestimate how educated people were in those days, especially when you look at the writings and the poetry and the amazing literacy of the Bible, even back in Genesis, etc. It is absolutely phenomenal, the craft that has gone into writing all of these ancient manuscripts. And often we think just because we got technology, we're brighter. No, God, these people, they were bright, and what they did with what was at hand was incredible all through history. One of the things that we can't say is that he was mistaken. Okay? That's what you say if you've never read the Gospel of Luke or Acts, because Luke wrote Acts as well. You can be mistaken about events, you can be mistaken about a conversation, but you can't be mistaken about the whole story arc of a single entire life and what happened for the next 20 years after. It's not possible. You can be mistaken about one or two things, but you can't be mistaken about the whole of someone's life and then the next 20 years after. So, Luke either carefully investigated everything from the beginning, or he didn't. Which is it? And if he did, you should take the time to investigate. Because something extraordinary happened, and it is good. It's good for you. It's good for your family. It's good for the world. If you read it, what is clear is Luke believes what he has written, what he documents actually took place. Coming on to verse 4, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, or Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. And this is so powerful. He says, the reason I wrote this is that so that you may know the certainty. In other words, I want you to be secure in your knowledge of the things that you have been taught. Luke is saying he wants to come in behind the things that you've been taught. Oops, sorry, going too far. And that he doesn't want you to be left with the impression that Christianity is just about faith and faith. You can investigate it. You can find out. This is why Luke has written it. We've just got to have faith in Jesus is not what Christianity is about. We've just got to believe stuff said nobody who followed Jesus after the resurrection. Okay? It's all rational. We put our faith in these things. Luke took the time to document these things so that people would know with certainty what had happened, because their faith would be anchored to an event and ultimately to a person. I'm going to read that again. Luke took the time to document these things so that people would know with certainty what had happened. This is not a fairy tale. This had happened. There is more historical evidence for the life of Jesus than any other historical figure. Okay? We just got to believe stuff, and because their faith would be anchored to an event that ultimately to a person. That person obviously is Jesus. So coming back to our timeline. So we had the event. The key event was the resurrection of Jesus. That was the extraordinary thing that had never happened before and has never happened since. The resurrection of Jesus. And that was world-changing, and they had to write about it. They had to tell it. And many people did so. And Luke's gospel, and John and Mark and Matthew were chosen as the four most reliable when the Bible was put together in the 4th century. So that event launched a movement which became the church, and when it was safe, when it was legal, the bishops came out of hiding and they put together the very first Bible. And that didn't happen until the 4th century, when the Bible was assembled. And in between, the time the documents were basically sort of from the 1st century to the 4th century, those documents were meticulously copied. Okay? More than any other documents. And distributed to the Christians who were being persecuted. And towards the end of the 3rd and start of the 4th century, Emperor Diocletian, who was the emperor who launched an empire-wide persecution of the Christians. He realized he needed to burn the literature as it fueled the epidemic of Christianity. No other pagan religions had all of this literature. It was just Christianity. Obviously, Judaism had the Old Testament scriptures, but Christianity had all this new literature. So he not only arrested the bishops and shut down house gatherings, but he burned the literature. And he tried to do it empire-wide. But it had been so broadly distributed that not even he could destroy it, even with the whole power of Rome behind him. And then Constantine became emperor, and that's a whole other story in itself. And basically ended up, I think his mother was a Christian, or so the story goes. And he actually finances the assembly of the very first Bible and orders that 50 copies are made because he wanted all the Christian bishops to work from the same text. And so the bishops brought all the documents together and decided which were the most authentic out of the thousands, and Luke was chosen as one of these. Have I convinced you yet that Luke is a reliable account of the life and teachings of Jesus? Because we can say of Jesus, he said extraordinary things, but it's not going to catch on. I mean, we're not going to love our enemies. We're not going to do for those who aren't going to do for us. Why would these things catch on? We're not going to be generous to people who aren't going to be generous in return. But you rose from the dead, and something happened in the world. It was that event that made the change. It's that event that, brought heaven to earth. So, if any one of the Gospels reflects the reality of Jesus, that should be enough for us to sit up straight, pay attention, because at the end of all 4 Gospels, Jesus is crucified by Rome and buried and seen as he rises from the dead. So when it comes to faith, it really comes down to the Gospels, which is why we're going to investigate these Gospels over the next few weeks, and specifically the Gospel of Luke. We're going to start kicking those tires to see where it takes us. Okay. Now, finally, as we come into communion, if you choose not to follow Jesus because it's inconvenient, that's a valid reason. Following Jesus is inconvenient. All right? But please don't choose not to follow Jesus because you don't think there's anything to the story of Jesus. Hopefully I've shown you that the account of Luke, at least, is a reliable account of what actually happened back then. So, why is it inconvenient? Well, it's going to require you to forgive people who don't deserve to be forgiven. You'll feel like you're giving them a gift after they've taken something from you. Following Jesus is going to require you to be less selfish, less full of yourself. There's going to be times when it's going to be an extraordinary inconvenience. It's going to cost you some money. Jesus said more about money than just about anything, way more than he said about heaven. It's going to cost you some time, because Jesus says we are his body, and as part of his body, there are things that we have to do, and we have to get for each other and for the world. But if you do decide to follow him, it will make your life better and make you better at life. That's a guarantee. I'm going to say that again. If you do decide to follow Jesus, it will make your life better and make you better at life. That's a guarantee. So, if you don't decide to follow Jesus because it's too inconvenient, that's valid. Jesus said, count the cost. Okay? But if you do follow him, it will make your life better. And it will make you better at life. Amen? So, we're coming on to communion. So we are the body of Christ, communion of the saints. And as we eat the bread and drink the wine, we recognize we need Jesus inside us. That's why we take his body and his blood inside us through the power of his Spirit, who promises to send us so that we can be part of how God is changing the world through his church, through the communion of the saints. So, my question, I suppose, to you as we take communion is Christianity being a bit too inconvenient recently? Are there other things that maybe, you've just not had the time, you've just not had the resources, you've just not had the capacity? It's going to require you to forgive people who don't deserve to be forgiven. Following Jesus is going to require you to be less selfish. It's going to cost you some money. It's going to cost you some time, because Jesus says we are his body. And as part of his body, there are things we have to do, and we get to do for each other and for the world. Jesus invites you to follow him and make your life better and be better at life. So just going to spend a moment where it's always good just to spend a moment in silence. What's God saying to you at this point? To examine yourself, as Paul would say, before we take communion. And then I'm going to ask Steve and Elaine just to come up, and we're going to do communion together. Today we will come and serve you the bread and the wine. So let's just spend 30 seconds, a minute, just in silence. What's God saying to you this morning?